Okay, so this is the second video on the history of banking. Different day, different shirt, different board that I'm using here. And I've got a weird diagram on the board behind me here. I'm going to explain it in just a second here. So the first video left off with the Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. And they established a national banking system in addition to all the state chartered banks that were the only kind of banks that had existed prior to the Civil War. So it ended the wildcat banking era and put us into what we call the national banking era. But the national banking era, whereas it didn't have the kind of problems that existed in the wildcat era, it had its own problems. So in the national banking era, some banks are national banks, and they are going to be monitored by the Treasury. The Treasury Department is going to send out inspectors on a regular basis. They're going to show up by surprise often, sometimes by appointment, but usually by surprise to a bank and say, we're here to audit you. We're going to spend the next several days going over all your books. We're going to look in your vault and see what count the money you've got on the shelf in reserve. And we're going to make sure that you're operating properly. So this was good for the people. It meant that the banking system was going to be monitored and watched by somebody in the government. State banks were not monitored like this, but because federal banks, national banks were being monitored, most of the states picked it up, moved up to the next level, and they started monitoring their own banks, doing the same kind of thing, doing these surprise audits. Now, let me tell you what reserves are briefly, because that's going to be an important element here. Banks don't have all the money that has been deposited by their customers in the vault on the shelf. They lend some of that money out to people who need to borrow money for buying property, for buying machinery, for financing whatever they're going to do. And that allows the economy to expand, and it in fact creates money, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter, chapter 35. But here in chapter 34, you need to know what reserves are. So reserves are the money that is still sitting in the vault, that if somebody comes in to withdraw money from their checking account, the bank can grab that cash and give them their 5s, 10s, $20 bills, $100 bills in actual cash. As I said, the bank doesn't have everybody's deposit in there. So if everybody wanted their money back all at the same time, the bank would actually run out of money. So banks keep sometimes as much as 50% of the actual deposits on reserve. And that's a very safe reserve ratio because very few people want to use cash. Most people want to write checks. And so into the period after the Civil War, more people trusted banks, more businessmen were using banks, little businessmen, farmers are now using banks to write checks rather than carry cash around with them. Cash, as I said in the earlier video, is dangerous. You could be robbed or killed for your money. So people are, are writing checks most of the time now. All right, so we know what reserves are. Now, if you are a farmer in an area of Indiana, say Terre Haute, Indiana, you're this guy right down here, and you bank at a bank in Terre Haute. It's a little bank, only has the several hundred, maybe 1,000 customers that are farmers and merchants in that rural area of Indiana. When you write checks locally, that's great. Everybody knows who your bank is. They look at your check, they see what bank it is, they accept the check, and you can purchase stuff. They take your check to your bank and get their cash for the check, and then they take that cash to their own bank in Terre Haute and deposit it in their account. So the cash is out of the bank only for a little while. In fact, sometimes people don't take the cash. They bank at the same bank you do. They deposit their check into the bank, and they say, no, I don't want cash for it, just add it to my account. And the banker simply makes a note that the cash that was in your account is now in the other guy's account. So that's called check clearing, okay? But let's say that you want to make a trip to Indianapolis. And when you get to Indianapolis, they say, we've never heard of your bank back in Terre Haute. We're not going to accept your check. But wait a minute. If your bank in Terre Haute has opened an account in Indianapolis, then the people in Indianapolis will say, all right, it's a little bank in Terre Haute, but we'll take it because we know your bank has an account with one of the banks here in Indianapolis, which is kind of a larger city. and does business with more people in a wider area. So your bank has some of its reserves in its own vault, but some of its reserves it has sent to a bank in Indianapolis so that you can do business there now. That facilitates you being able to do business there. What if you wanted to go to Cincinnati, a larger city, to do maybe a larger thing? You're going to buy some new farming equipment, so you're going to write an even bigger check. They have no idea who your bank in Terre Haute is. But if this Indiana bank has money on deposit at a bank in Cincinnati, then they can say, all right, that bank has an account with us. We'll take your check and we'll take the money out of that bank's account with us. We'll send them a note saying we withdrew some money from your account with us because of this account holder way out there in Terre Haute. They'll send a note to your bank in Terre Haute saying we've taken money out of your account, and then your bank will take money out of your account to cover that. So that's called check clearing, and you can see this is kind of a complicated process, and it often takes somewhere between 2 to 7 days for your check to clear. So the money is actually still sitting in your account for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days before finally it's withdrawn from your account and that check has cleared. That's called the process of check clearing. Okay, all right. The big Cincinnati bank had many of its people who were fairly wealthy landowners or businessmen, industrialists, and they needed to do business on larger levels. So your Cincinnati bank had a significant amount of its reserves on deposit at a bank in Chicago so that business could be done. Okay. And then the Chicago bank had a lot of its reserves on reserve at a bank in New York City because New York was the banking capital of the United States. It has been since the late 1700s and still is today. A lot of international business is done through the banks, the large banks, huge banks in New York City. This is happening in all the various areas of the country. This is the West with LA, Seattle, San Francisco. This is the Midwest, St. Louis, Cincinnati, funneling into the Chicago banks. This is the East, Boston, Pittsburgh area, funneling into Philadelphia. This is the South, okay? And this is just a little bit, obviously, of what's going on. I don't even have Texas and Arizona in here yet, okay? Now, this pyramiding of reserves is an important problem. Why is it a problem? All right, what happens if there is a problem in the South over here, some kind of a blight or a virus or something like that, and business slows down tremendously? Well, as very little business is going on, and a lot of people are withdrawing their money from their banks because they're trying to buy food and survive and pay their rent, these banks say, we're running out of money. The little banks and the little communities out here, they withdraw some of their reserves from these intermediate banks here. They start running low on reserves. They withdraw their money from these banks at this level. They start running out of reserves. They withdraw their money from Atlanta banks. They start running low on reserves and withdraw money from New York. So this area of the country is a problem, and a lot of money is being withdrawn. The reserves are falling, and it's kind of threatening this area here. But these other areas are still thriving. Business is going on. People are leaving their money in their banks. Everything's going fine. And so once whatever the problem was, the blight or the virus is gone in this area, and they return to regular business, everything's fine over there. And they redeposit their money into the pyramid, and everything's fine. But what happens if two areas of the country go bad at the same time? The South and the East Coast. Everything along the eastern half of the United States is in disarray, and money is being withdrawn like crazy. Now the Philadelphia and Atlanta banks are teetering. Their reserves are getting very low, maybe only 10 or 5% of the deposits that have been in there. They're taking money out of the New York bank, and now the New York bank is really seriously worried about the reserves that are being withdrawn from its bank. And half the country is in problem, okay? Maybe we'll weather that. Maybe some of these banks will fail, okay? remember what I said about a failing bank? Everybody's gone to withdraw the money and the bank didn't have it. And so it had to be shut down and people lost their deposits. Okay. Um, what happens if there is a nationwide panic and money gets drawn out of the reserves and these banks are now the ones that may wind up having to close? That is a serious problem. These kinds of nationwide panics occurred several times. 1893, 1873, 1893, again in 1897, I believe. And then finally in 1907, a very serious banking crisis occurred throughout the country. And a lot of these top banks nearly failed. And if it wasn't for the government going to a huge, the richest man in the world at the time, or at least in the United States, a guy named J.P. Morgan, he actually saved the banking system by pulling a lot of resources out of his international businesses and propping up some of the largest banks in the country, especially in New York. That really scared people in Congress and the president at the time. It was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a really smart guy and he knew a lot about a lot of things, but he didn't know much about banking. So he punted. He asked somebody in the Senate, a guy named Aldrich, Senator Aldrich, to form a committee and figure out what to do about the American banking system. This pyramiding of reserves was clearly a big problem. Well, nobody knew immediately what to do. So this committee took 5-6 years to study the issue. It took a long time. Roosevelt was no longer president. Taft became president. All through Taft's administration, he was only president for 4 years, if you recall. This committee is working on trying to figure out a solution to this pyramiding of reserves and hoping there's not going to be another banking crisis like there was in 1907. Finally, in late 1912, early 1913, the committee has a solution. It draws up a plan. Woodrow Wilson becomes president, and one of the things he does in the first 3 months of his term of president is present this new banking bill, and he backs this new banking bill that is presented in the Senate. It passes the Senate, it passes the House of Representatives, and he signs it into law, and that is the Federal Reserve Act, which is going to be explained in the next video. So we're at just under 13 minutes on this one. These are long videos, but now you know a lot about the history of banking in the United States, at least an overview of the history of banking in the United States, and why the Federal Reserve Act was so important when it was established in 1913. Next video coming up.